Hello, and welcome to my Splatoon 2 tutorial series. Welcome to Inkopolis. This is part 4, and in part 4 I will teach you about some basic team tactics that you can deploy to help work with your team more effectively. These will be useful in solo queue, or if you decide to join a team for competitive play. In this tutorial, I will cover 6 basic team tactics, which are flanking, pincer, ambush, cover fire or cover ink, hold the ink line or become the beacon, and fire suppression. First, let's briefly define tactics. In order to do that, we need to look at its place in the greater picture of combat planning. There are only 3 elements that I am referring to when discussing Splatoon 2: strategy, tactics, and technique. Strategy is the general overall plan for victory. In Splatoon 2, this is largely determined by the game modes and their victory conditions. You can have some strategic plans within a single game mode's victory conditions if you are on a team and can plan such strategies. But while playing in solo queue, consider your strategy to be entirely determined by the game mode's victory conditions. Tactics are the small, localized plans that are used to successfully realize your strategy and usually involve coordination with teammates. They are kind of like moves in a board game. Splatoon 2 is a team-based game, so most of the tactics you should use are team tactics. This tutorial is almost entirely composed of team tactics. The team tactic that most gamers are familiar with is called flanking. Techniques are the specific moves that you do as a player that help to fulfill the purpose of your tactics, which in turn accomplish the goals you need in order to realize your strategy. One example is to move through ink slowly, so that you are invisible in order to sneak into place for a pincer or an ambush. Techniques are also anything you practice that gives you an advantage, such as flicking your charger to mask your intentions, or sub-strafing, which is the practice of holding down the sub-weapon button while rising out of your ink in order to make a faster turn in the opposite direction. I will teach some basic introductory techniques in Welcome to Inkopolis, Part 5. I'm going to start with a few general pointers that you should be doing no matter what. When you are not shooting, you should always be in cover or hiding in ink. When you come out of cover or rise out of the ink, you should have already planned your path back to cover, and you should already have a backup route in case an opponent pops up in your escape route. Super jump with true purpose. I know you are encouraged to super jump to get back to the action, but that's only true and effective in specific circumstances. I will discuss super jumping effectively in future videos on specific ranked game modes, as the best practices guidelines are unique to each mode. Playing solo queue is a game of opportunity as much as anything, so don't go out of your way trying to employ these tactics. What is important is that you learn to understand what these tactics look like, so you can see when you have been given an opportunity to use them to help your team win. It's also important to understand when these tactics may be happening to you, so you can act appropriately or even preempt them. And lastly, from this point forward, in order to keep my tutorials light and whimsical as the game, I will heretofore refer to the idea of kill or killing as splat or splatting, and the idea of death or dying as pop or popping. Tactic number 1, flanking. What is flanking? Flanking is approaching opponents from a side angle while they are otherwise engaged to the front. It's necessary that the opponent is engaged because the idea is that opponents are distracted while you try to attack them from the side, just out of their field of view. It's also the most well-known tactic amongst gamers. The purpose. Flanking has 2 purposes. The primary purpose is to force your opponents to move. Either abandon their position so that you can take it, or force the opponents to move where you want them. The second, more secondary purpose is to splat opponents quickly with reduced risk to you and the team. Strengths. The greatest strength of flanking is that a flank is easy to deploy, and you can do so very quickly. The two team members involved in a flank have a vague L shape, and moving into that L shape is quick to do from almost all angles. The only thing that can slow you down are terrain features and other opponents. Flanking also forces an opponent to split their fire, which means that they need to fire in multiple directions to protect themselves and win the engagement. A skilled player will flee from such a situation. Weaknesses. The primary weakness of flanking is that an incoming flank is fairly easy to spot. It may not seem this way to new Splatoon 2 players or players who are new to tactical team shooters in general, as they tend to develop a little bit of tunnel vision. But you can catch an incoming flank with just a little camera movement, or by developing a good sense of which escape direction is safe, by developing a good sense of the action in the field. You also need to frequently check your map, as doing so can help you spot incoming flanks from players you cannot see. Do this. While trying to play for the objective in your game mode, be on the lookout for your teammates. Try to track them visually if you can. For those you can't see, check your map. You can find your teammates by their icons, and you can assess their situation by checking the ink around them. Changing swirls of color indicate that they are engaged already. If the area is all your color, they are probably safe and not engaged. If the color is mostly the opponent's color, your teammate probably will not be there for much longer. Only check your map while it's spawn, while on cover, or hiding in ink, or you might pop while trying to check the map. Stay near teammates while playing, but not too close. For beginners, a good rule to start with is within range of your weapon. If you have a charger, yes, you can stay at maximum range and still flank effectively, as long as you are able to move around the map quickly. Also, while moving, try to always be hiding in cover or in ink. This increases the likelihood that you are not seen until you need to flank, making the tactic a surprise for your opponent and greatly increasing your chances of success. Eventually, an opponent will target you or a teammate. When this happens, in both cases, move away from your teammate. Staying close makes it easier for your opponent to splat both of you with their main or sub-weapon. Hopefully your teammate will also move away from you, and the two of you will very quickly achieve the characteristic L shape of a flank, and splat. You flank the opponent in less than a second. With a little luck, you will splat your opponent. Skilled players are sneaky, slippery, and have a strong sense of self-preservation. If you are fighting a skilled player, they might easily escape your flank. That's okay. You still won the engagement and are free to ink or re-ink the turf. Rainmaker and Tower Control ranked modes have objectives that are permanent, movable, and highly visible. In these modes, planning flanks ahead of time can be very effective for reclaiming the objective or escorting the objective to the goal. There will be more on that in later videos about those specific game modes. There is a more strategic form of flanking that involves much bigger moves. This is a longer, planned action to flank a position on the map, as opposed to other players. This takes a lot more time, but it is worth it in certain cases. Strategic flanking is very effective and common in the Splat Zones ranked mode. Tactic number 2. The Pincer. What is a pincer? A pincer is a tactical move that is very similar to a flank, except that instead of attack from the side, you attack from the rear, or the opposite side of other teammates. The idea of the opposite side is what's important, as you can deploy a pincer by attacking the left of your opponent while another teammate attacks from the right, so not necessarily front and back. The purpose. The pincer has two main purposes, and in Splatoon 2, they are pretty much the same as the flank, but in opposite priorities. The primary purpose is to splat the opponent, and the secondary purpose is to force the opponent to move. Typically, a pincher is deployed to dislodge an extraordinarily bothersome opponent, such as a charger sniper, or a pair of players that will not get off splat zones and will not let you near it. Strengths. The main strength is that it is nearly impossible to survive a well-executed pincher. As a player, you will be taken completely by surprise, and it's extremely difficult to spin 180 degrees and effectively defend yourself if you survive long enough to do so. Even if you do, you are likely to pop to the opponents you were just fighting to your front side, but they are now shooting you in the back. If you find yourself caught in a pincher, the best course of action is to flee to your left or right, assuming you survive the initial attack from your blind spot. If you are doing this to opponents, you should splat them without question, and if you do not, you should have forced them to abandon their position and yield it to you. Weaknesses. Pinchers usually take a relatively long time to set up, especially if you are trying to do this in solo queue, as you have to assess the field for yourself, and your teammates can't inform you of opportunities that you cannot see. The trade is usually worth it, as you will buy a lot of time and breathing room for your team that could be critical to winning your match. But it's risky due to the time involved. Complete failure can be just as bad as success is good. If you or teammates have poor aim or choke on the situation, you might pop instead of splat, and you've wasted a lot of time that could have been spent elsewhere. Lastly, if you don't know the game maps well, and you don't know how to get around quickly and unseen, you could easily get caught on the way. That may not necessarily turn out badly for you, but it will result in more wasted time on your part. Do this. First of all, do not do this at all without a clear opportunity or need. As I stated, the payoff is big if you pull it off, but the risk is great if you do not. The first step is the same as the flank. You need to gain an understanding of the field, so you need to look around and check your map, which you should always be doing when it's safe, by the way. Remember to hide while checking the map, or do so at spawn so that you do not pop. Snipers that pose a great threat always qualify as a need to deploy a pincher. Flanks can be deployed in plain view of your opponents. When you split from your teammate, you will split your opponent's fire and accomplish your goal whether they see you or not. In order to use a pincher effectively, surprise is required, so you must remain undetected until you are prepared and ready to attack. Other than using stealth to get behind your opponent, there are no hard rules to setting up a pincher. You just need to know the game map well and use stealth to get into position. Tactic number 3, ambush. What is an ambush? An ambush is when you wait in hiding for your target to come close, and then you splat them. In Splatoon 2, this is always preferable to do when you can shoot your opponent in the back, but this is not always possible, and certainly not always necessary. The purpose. The purpose of an ambush in Splatoon 2 is to prevent the opponent from reaching the objective, or a position whereby they may pressure the objective. This is done most effectively on opponents who are trying to return to the match from the respawn pad, and even more so when your team has good turf control. Strengths. The main strength of an ambush is that it is extremely effective at splatting an opponent, and it's almost impossible to counter when executed with skill and appropriate knowledge of the game map. Preventing any opponent from reaching his or her point of engagement can have huge payoffs for your match. Weaknesses. You need to have intimate knowledge of the game maps, and you need to be good at reading players' movements. These are both things that can only come with experience. Without them, you will have a hard time, and if your ambush fails, it could be a big setback for the team. Lastly, you must wait. Matches are very short, and every second spent waiting is a second wasted if your ambush does not succeed. The bad news is that these characteristics make ambushes not very friendly as a tactic for new players. However, The good news is that these characteristics also mean that it is best to start puzzling them out from day one so that you are appropriately skilled and knowledgeable as you rank up. Do this. To set up a proper and effective ambush, you need to ensure you have control of enough turf such that you can reach your ambush point without detection. This is much easier to do on some maps than on others. Also, you need to know where players tend to move on the current game map and during the current game mode. Choose a spot that is within your control, or which you can quickly take control, and that is near a path that opposing players are likely to use. Then, check for these 3 characteristics for your ambush hiding spot. Characteristic 1. It should be in a blind spot. Your ambush hiding spot should be placed such that it is impossible for opponents to see you until they have passed your position. Smart players may notice this and try to flush out potential ambushers with bombs or other tactics, but matches vary widely in how likely this is to happen. You must measure your opponents on a case-by-case basis. Number 2. There should be nearby cover and a plan for retreat. You should retreat from your ambush spot after you complete your attack, since there is a splat camera, and your opponent can see what you do for a few seconds. They will know where to find you. Plan your retreat before you ambush. When doing so, plan a route that provides nearby cover. Do this because there could easily be more opponents using the same path. Planning a quick retreat behind cover will greatly reduce the likelihood that you get shot in the back yourself. Number 3. Your ambush spot should require little to no movement to attack your targeted opponent. This shouldn't have to be said, and if you follow the rule to pick a spot near a path players actually use, this won't generally happen. But you might start thinking about doing this for whatever reason, and you can't. If you have to chase down your opponent to splat them, it's not an ambush, and a variety of negative outcomes could be the result. Tactic number 4. Cover fire or cover ink. What is cover ink? Ever hear someone in an action movie say or shout, "Go, go, I'll cover you," before proceeding to shoot a gun at an enemy while his or her buddy runs elsewhere? That's often called cover fire on film. That is a real concept, but one I will cover later as a tactic called fire suppression. Here, I'm calling this tactic cover ink, as I'm referring to literally covering your teammates with ink. This tactic is most comfortably deployed with the longest range weapons, but it's not necessary. The purpose. The purpose of cover inking is to aid teammates in their efforts by ensuring the turf around their feet is covered in your team's ink. This also includes trying to save them from popping by providing barriers of your team's ink. This can be done with the main weapon, sub-weapon, or special weapon of your weapon kit. Strengths. Providing cover ink is a tactic that is very simple and very quick to do, and requires very little skill to do effectively and when needed. Providing cover ink, in fact, is the cornerstone of Salmon Run at higher levels of play. Now, you can't resurrect your teammates in PvP modes, but you can provide some more friendly turf for them to move around or escape a dangerous situation, or throw your ink wall in front of them from a higher platform to protect them from an opponent that you saw coming. Or, you can surround your teammates on the tower in your Stingray beam so that they have a few seconds to push your score down without interruption. Weaknesses. The greatest weakness of cover ink is that it's almost impossible to do effectively with a very short-range weapon such as a Splooshomatic or Splattershot Jr. In fact, you may be the one who needs cover ink if you are using one of these main weapons. Your sub-weapon and special weapon may still leave you some options. Providing cover ink can also leave you open to a flank from opposing reinforcements, so it's something you always need to be looking for while providing cover ink to your teammates. Do this. Cover inking has guidelines rather than instructions, so here they are. As a general rule, you should not provide cover ink if you are under threat from an opponent. The only exception is if you are gambling on self-sacrifice in order to help your team make a winning push in overtime, or otherwise at the end of the match timer. If you have a long-range weapon, consider opportunities where a distant teammate is caught in a duel with an opponent. Simply shooting your ink at your teammate will help make sure that he or she can still move around easily and can provide that thin edge needed to win. Keep in mind that this should be done when your teammate is in your range, but the opponent is not. If the opponent is in your range, you should attack the opponent. Power Control and Rainmaker are ranked game modes that have easy-to-see, slow-moving objectives that need a teammate attending them to keep them moving. You may often find that the objective and your teammate are too distant to easily reach with your main weapon. And if you just popped, you probably cannot reach your opponents either. In times like these, your sub-weapon may be able to reach your teammate, so you can throw them at your teammate to protect him or her from opposing ink. This can also be done with special weapons. The Stingray in particular can be very effective at this, as it will completely protect your teammates from most damage, and they can move freely while within the actual Stingray beam. If you have high ground, you can see a lot of activity from both sides of the match. You can notice an opponent closing in on unaware teammates. In these situations, you can block opponents with your main, sub, or special weapons from surprising your teammates. You may even splat the opponent if they are surprised or respond poorly. Anything you can do to help teammates by preserving mobility and protecting them from opposing ink will work. Always be on the lookout for opportunities. Tactic number 5, holding the line. What is holding the line? In Splatoon 2, this refers to holding your position near the objective or behind the opposing team. You might be trading ink with the opponents, or you might be hiding. If you're the only Cephalo kid left standing on your team, I advise hiding. You should be careful to hold your position, whichever action you decide on. The purpose. You do this in order to provide a safer super jump point for your teammates to use to quickly return to the objective and or possibly ambush the opponent. Super jumping is normally very, very risky, especially in ranked modes, as it can be difficult to tell when your teammates are safe, and even then, they may cease being safe before you reach the jump point. Strengths. This tactic is extremely effective as it can result in the sudden arrival of additional teammates in unexpected places. This often allows a team to make a devastating play against the opponent by attacking together in numbers and from an unexpected angle. This tactic is also very easy to execute. You only need a little knowledge of where to hide and a healthy sense of self-preservation. Weaknesses. The greatest weakness happens if you are discovered. If you are discovered, this will certainly spell doom for your teammates. If they have already started their super jump, the opponents will casually wait around the highlighted jump point for your team to arrive and promptly send them back to spawn. Even if you manage to escape after being discovered, your teammate's destination has already been chosen. Do this. Pay attention to the action in front of you and, this is critical, the team status indicators at the top of the screen. If you are not already doing this out of habit, you need to practice doing this to make it habit. You should be making a decision on holding the line when 2 teammates are down, and you should go into hiding to hold the line when 3 teammates are down. Do nothing until they arrive or they rejoin the match elsewhere. If you have a long-range weapon, like a Hydra Splatling or Splat Charger, you may be able to hold the line from higher ground while still returning ink on certain maps. You will have to decide for yourself if that is the right decision for you and your team. Tactic number 6. Fire Suppression or Ink Suppression. What is ink suppression? In the real world, fire suppression refers to a tactic where a force pins an opposing force in place by firing their weapons towards specific areas near or around the opposing force. This works by means of threat. The force's fire threatens the lives of the opposing force, so the opposing force hesitates, or refuses to move into the area that is receiving the suppression fire. In Splatoon 2, I'm going to call this ink suppression, and it works very much the same way as in the real world. Ink suppression is the suppressing or redirecting of opponent movement by shooting ink or using sub or special weapons directed toward the opponent or the path you are trying to block off. The purpose. The purpose of ink suppression is to prevent your opponents from advancing toward the objective, or advancing the objective itself. This can and does include using ink suppression to protect teammates riding the tower, carrying the Rainmaker, or running in power clams. Strengths. Ink suppression is simple and effective to deploy and requires little technical skill, as it's not even necessary to actually hit your opponent in order to make ink suppression work. If you do have good aim, all the better. Additionally, if your opponents do not have a healthy sense of self-preservation, you will probably splat them, and that is generally a good thing because they can't chase you when you eventually need to adjust your position. Weaknesses. The greatest weakness of ink suppression is that it will never hold back your opponents for very long. Very inexperienced and unknowledgeable players may faceplant themselves into your ink for a little while longer than they should, but eventually everyone is going to get tired of it and move somewhere else or try something else, or charge up their special and throw it at you. If all the rest of your team pops, leaving you the only Cephalo kid standing, then maintaining ink suppression might be a sound tactic so that you can provide a safe super jump point for your team, but that's a judgment you need to make in the moment. Do this. To apply ink suppression, you need to be able to identify choke points. Choke points are places on a map where the opponent must suffer a loss of mobility in order to pass through it. Often, this is where your opponents must leave a very large or wide space by passing through a much more narrow space in order to move forward. On the ground level, this tends to look like short and narrow hallways, and it tends to look like narrow platforms when the terrain is elevated. Fire your weapons into the choke point. Ink suppression is as simple as that. Do not do this without purpose and without some clear evidence that you are actually hindering your opponents. If you do not have these things, you are not being effective, and you should move on to other things. Ink suppression is best deployed with medium to long-range weapons, but very skilled players can be successful in deploying ink suppression with short-range weapons. In conclusion, this is just a set of introductory tactics to help you get started. There are many more, and competitive players are always trying to discover or create new ones. I hope you find these helpful and fun to use. In the next video, we will look at a few introductory techniques. Take care, stay off the hook, and wear a mask.